Okay, so now we're going to talk about some cellular transport mechanisms. And if you're looking at the cell wall, what you really need to kind of look at is the cell wall is created of two layers. You have a hydrophilic and then a hydrophobic layer. And this is something that actually loves water or hates water, right? And so it's going to either repel or attract water. And you can see the hydrophilic layer is the exterior of the cell, and the interior of the cell is hydrophobic. Diffusion is the movement of solutes, right? And that's from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration to evenly distribute the particles in the space that's available. And where this happens is it's basically at a cellular level, and it's based on the permeability of the membrane and the concentration gradient. And so a good way to think about this is if you had two balloons that had a very permeable membrane, and you had salt water in one and then regular water in another one, or low salt water, the water wouldn't shift back and forth. It would mostly be the solutes, right? So as the water or the solutes kind of maintained the same volume equally, the salt would end up equalizing across the two pockets or the two balloons full of water. We wouldn't end up with water in one and no water in the other. It's keeping the fluid balance the same, but the actual concentration or the thing that's been dissolved in that fluid is what's making the shift. Okay, now in osmosis is very similar to diffusion, but this is actually the solvent being moved across from one concentration to another so that they would equalize themselves out. This is in the case of fluid moving back and forth across particular areas, and the membrane being permeable to the solvent but not to the solute, right? So if we're able to get water across a membrane but not the particulates of sodium, that would be osmosis, right? Think of the water filtration systems in your house, trying to remove the salt or other calcium and things like that out of your water. It's because the membrane will allow the actual water itself to move across, but not any of the salts or solids. Osmotic pressure is that water to move by osmosis, right? It's that it wants to move on its own under the pressure of having too many salts or other solutes in the water. So it's going to actually try to push its way out so that, again, we can have that balance from one side to the other. Okay, so now we're looking at cellular transport mechanisms, and the first one is facilitated diffusion, and that's a process in which the carrier molecule moves across a substance in or out of the cells in areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. So again, this is one of those things where if we needed glucose in the cell, we can actually push that in by the use of insulin and other things like that. There's no real energy required to make that happen. So active transport requires energy and a carrier mechanism, and then the movement is opposite the normal movement of diffusion. So body fluid balance being divided into two groups, which is intracellular fluid and then extracellular fluid, and extracellular fluid being the intravascular fluid, which is your plasma, and then the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that's in between the cells but not necessarily in an actual vessel. The fluid balance maintains homeostasis. It's regulated by antidiuretic hormone from the pituitary gland and thirst, and then that fluid imbalance can be life-threatening because, again, if we're looking at osmosis and diffusion, too much of a fluid can actually cause a dilution of the required salts in the bloodstream, which create homeostasis. Okay, so the nervous system, anatomy, and physiology. One of the things you're going to see several times in your test banks are going to be afferent versus efferent. And I want to get this out in the open right up front so that you can try to understand how this is being regulated. Afferent versus efferent is going to be the affect versus the e-effect, right? And so that's sensory versus motor. And an easy way to think about this is a hot flame causes the afferent or affect of the body sensing the temperature change, which is going to cause harm, and the effect is the motor system of you removing that body part from the flame. So if you can try to remember that the affect is causing an effect, which is the reaction to it, that should help you in the test questions and understanding sensory versus motor nervous systems. Now, the biggest components of the nervous system is the brain, obviously, the spinal cord, and then thousands and thousands of nerves. And you can divide the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system. So as we're coming down, right, we see the brain and the spinal nerves, right? And so that is the main trunk of the nervous system, which is the brain talking to the spinal nerves. And what you should try to remember is that there are reflex loops in the spinal nerve system back out into the motor nerves and sensory nerves, whereas the actual event causing the effect doesn't actually have to make its way to the brain. It can short circuit itself, and that's a reflex kind of system. So if you're looking at this chart, you can kind of see the voluntary nerves and then the involuntary nerves, and then sensory and motor nerves. So the brain is the controlling organ of the body, and it's the center of consciousness, and the main components of the brain are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum being the frontal lobes, and then the cerebellum being towards the rear at the base of the skull, and then the brainstem exiting the skull into the actual spinal tract. The spinal cord is the extension of the brainstem. It can carry information to and from the brain, and this is really your voluntary movement, right? And so if you tell your hand to close, your brain tells that function to happen, and those signals are transferred from the brain to the fingertips so that you can close your hand into a fist. And there's many connections between the sensory and the motor nerves. And again, if you remember the afferent versus efferent that I spoke about earlier, it'll make things make a lot more sense down the road when you're trying to figure out where these nerves are coming and going from. The meninges is a membrane, again, much like the pleural membrane around the lungs and the thoracic cavity, right? It's a little thick membrane that encloses the spinal cord. It protects it and lets the spinal fluid kind of bathe the spinal cord inside that meninges. It's also surrounding the brain matter inside the skull. And so we have the dura mater, which is the outer toughest layer, the arachnoid matter, which is the second layer, and the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. The meninges float in that CSF, right? And that's cerebral spinal fluid. Now, when we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, the divisions are the somatic nervous system, which controls the voluntary muscles, the autonomic nervous system, which has two parts, right? And that's the sympathetic nervous system, which is your response for fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that slows down the body. When I learned it, it was the feed and breed. Sensory nerves carry information from the body, right? Again, this is what I want everybody to remember, the affect versus the effect. So your sensory nerves, again, having that sensation of flame against skin, and then the motor nerves carrying that information, causing you to withdraw from the flame. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves at the base of the brain that performs different functions throughout the body. I'm not going to require anybody to actually memorize these. If you go into paramedic, that's a completely different situation. But you have your 12 cranial nerves kind of laid out there for you. And so take a little while and kind of understand this. This will come up if you're doing stroke assessment, and if you really want to understand what particular nerve is being affected by the lack of blood flow, this is something that might be of a great benefit to you. Now we're going to look at the integumentary system, which is the skin. And we have two parts to the skin. That's the epidermis, which is a superficial part, and then the dermis, which is a little bit deeper. And then we have subcutaneous tissue that lies below the skin, and then a germinal layer of epidermis producing new skin cells, which are pushed up into the dermis, which contains the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, which is the oil producing glands in the skin, hair follicles, blood vessels, and then the nerve endings. You guys will understand when we start doing the IV sticks on one another that those nerve endings are very superficial in the skin, And the longer you take to puncture the skin, the more painful the IV actually is. It's a pretty detailed diagram of the epidermis and the dermis. And you can see that the dermis is a very thin layer. It's more of the protective layer, and then that the dermis is containing most of the structures that are actually in the skin itself. So the function of the skin is to protect the body from the environment, right? Intact skin is probably one of the best things that we have in regards to keeping germs and other invaders away from us. It's going to regulate body temperature. Because of the blood flow throughout the muscles, the skin is kind of like a thin or a tough layer that doesn't let a lot of body heat out. And then it transmits information from the environment to the brain. So your sensation of cold or heat, wetness, and other things like that. And it plays a major role in hydration levels, because the skin will actually keep your body from losing fluid from evaporation. Now we're going to talk about the digestive system and its anatomy, and that's the gastrointestinal tract, which is your stomach and the intestines. And this actually kind of starts from the mouth. As we masticate or chew, the salivary glands are going to produce saliva, which helps start to break down foods. And then we go into the pharynx, which is that cavity in the mouth towards the throat, and the esophagus. We also have the pancreas and the rectum and the anus. And then, we have some organs that feed into these to help us break down food and nutrients. And that would be the liver and the gallbladder. So the abdomen is the second major body cavity, right? That being directly below the pulmonary thorax system. And when we're looking at that, the right upper quadrant of the abdomen is going to house the liver, the gallbladder, some of the colon, and a large portion of the small intestine. The left upper quadrant is going to hold the stomach, the spleen, and some of the colon and the small intestine. The right lower quadrant holding the cecum, the ascending colon, and the appendix, and the left lower quadrant descending colon and the sigmoid parts of the colon. The mouth consisting of the lips, cheeks, gums, teeth, and tongue, and it's lined by a mucous membrane. The salivary glands producing nearly 1.5 liters of saliva daily. Saliva is 98% water and 2% mucus, salts, and organic compounds. And it serves as a binder for chewed food and as a mouth lubricant. So remember that quite literally, the very beginning parts of digestion come from the saliva and the chewing of the food. Oral pharynx, a tubular structure extending vertically from the back of the mouth to the esophagus and the trachea. The automatic movement of the pharynx during swallowing, it lifts the larynx to permit the epiglottis to close over it. And so like we were saying earlier, we want to make sure that the epiglottis is moved up out of the way of the trachea when we're doing our supraglottic airways. But its primary function is to close off the trachea as we swallow. So it moves liquids and solids into the esophagus and away from the trachea. The esophagus is a collapsible tube. It's about 10 inches long, and it extends from the pharynx to the stomach. Again, there's an esophageal sphincter that helps to kind of seal off stomach acid from the esophagus and then ultimately into the mouth. There are contractions of muscles in the esophagus, right? This is that smooth muscle that propel or help to move food from the first initial part of the swallowing in the mouth to the stomach. Liquids will pass with just a little bit of assistance. It's usually by gravity. The superior portion of the esophagus is voluntary. The inferior portion is involuntary. It just happens after we start the initial movement. The stomach is a hollow organ in the left upper quadrant. It's going to convert food into mixed semi-solid mass, which is called chyme. The muscle contractions in the stomach wall help to churn up food with that acid or the gastric juices, and then the chyme moves into the small bowel in a regular small amount to be the initial absorption of nutrients. Okay, so the pancreas has two intertwined portions. You have the exocrine pancreas and the endocrine pancreas. The exocrine pancreas secretes pancreatic juice into the GI tract. The endocrine pancreas produces insulin, which is going to be released into the blood, controlling the ability for the body to absorb sugar or glucose into the cells. The liver is the largest solid organ in the abdomen. It renders poisonous substances produced by digestion harmless. So a lot of drugs that we take or medications need to have a first pass. And so there are alkaloids that are kind of knocked off by the liver, and this is why people who tend to take large amounts of drugs that need to be absorbed by the GI tract can end up with pretty significant liver damage. There are forms and factors necessary for blood clotting in the liver. The plasma production and the immune response is all part of some of the functions in the liver. It also produces bile to help digest fat. So the liver also stores sugar and starch for immediate use, and this is where you guys are going to be tested on the application of glucagon in a hypoglycemic event, right? That particular drug is going to cause the liver to release its stores of sugar and starches so that the body can kind of maintain some energy. And again, we'll get a little bit deeper into that as you guys start studying your drugs. Small intestine is a major hollow organ, as well as the large intestine, obviously. It absorbs most of the products of digestion and transports that into the veins to be transported into the livers, which will detoxify. The liver is going to take its initial store of glucose before it lets glucose into the rest of the bloodstream. Again, needing insulin to open up cells to allow sugar into the cellular wall or to be converted into adipose tissue. Components of the small intestine are the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Then we get into that large intestine, which again is still a hollow organ, and their components there are the cecum, the colon, and the rectum. It absorbs the final 5 to 10% of food and the majority of water. And as it's pulling the water in, the solid stool passes out of the body through the anus. The appendix is a 3 to 4 inch long small section coming off of the intestine, and the large intestine to be specific. It can easily trap some kind of fecal matter and become infected, which is where we get appendicitis, which may, in the wrong case, require an appendectomy to remove that section of colon. The rectum is the lowermost end of the colon. It's large and hollow, and it stores quantities of feces until it's expelled. The anus is the 2-inch canal at the end lined with skin. There are sphincters there, circular muscles to control the escape of liquid gases and solids. And this can be flexed voluntarily and automatically so that we can control those bowel movements or anything that might be trying to leave the GI tract. Digestive system physiology and succession, different secretions, primarily the enzymes are added to food by the salivary glands. Again, that's the beginning of digestion. The stomach, the liver, the pancreas, and the small intestine, all trying to break that food down so that we can absorb the nutrition and other components of food that are necessary for survival into the bloodstream. We're going to convert food into basic sugars, fatty acids, and amino acids, and these products cross the wall of the intestine and travel through the portal vein into the liver. The GI tract being one of the most vascular parts of the body. The liver further processes and stores or transports to the heart, and then the circulatory system pushes the things that the heart does not need to the rest of the body, and then nourishing all the cells with obviously oxygen added. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the endocrine system, and that's made up of glands located throughout the body. This removes or concentrates or alters materials from the blood and then secretes them back into the body. The glands secrete proteins called hormones, which regulate mood, growth, and development, controls metabolism, sexual development, and many of the other body functions. The pituitary gland is called the master gland. It secretes control of other endocrine glands. It is obviously one of the triggers for many of the other body parts to secrete their own hormones. It secretes growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropin hormone, gonadotrophic hormone, and ADH and oxytocin. The hypothalamus is the main link between the endocrine system and the nervous system. Thyroid gland is a large gland at the base of the neck. It manufactures and secretes hormones that have a role in growth, development, and metabolism. It also secretes calcitonin, which helps maintain normal blood calcium levels. It will tell the body to remove calcium from bones or to deposit. Parathyroid glands are located on the thyroid, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. We'll move down to the pancreas. This is an organ of both the endocrine and the digestive system. It produces insulin and glucagon. Insulin causes the uptake and the metabolism of sugar, right? And by causing uptake, we're saying that that's a hormone that is only able to open the glucose uptake into the cell. So if we have a lack of insulin, we have an inability to get glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells, causing hyperglycemia. It also helps with fatty acids and amino acids, because as the glucose shifts into the cell, it's going to take those other things in. Glucagon stimulates the breakdown of glycogen into its glucose form, and it stimulates the liver and the kidneys to produce glucose as well. The adrenal glands, right, adrenal, right, which means that it's sitting over the top of the kidney, renal being the root word for kidney. The secrete sex hormones and hormones in maintaining water and salt balance. The adrenal cortex mediates the fight and flight response, right? It's adrenaline, right? So if you're looking at that, adrenal, adrenaline, epi and norepi, both being a derivative or another version of adrenaline. The reproductive glands and the hormones, so gonads and ovaries in women and testes in men, major female hormones being estrogen, progesterone, and HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin. The ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, and in developing fetus manufactures HCG, that is the prototypical pregnancy hormone. Testosterone is produced by the testes, and it's also produced in females, but much smaller extent by the adrenal glands and the ovaries. The urinary system, controlling the discharge of waste filtered from the blood by the kidneys. The kidneys are also a big culprit in CHF because of the afterload that a injured heart may not pump against. The kidneys can actually create a kind of a debilitating circular loop where we kind of control how much fluid is retained by the body, which will ultimately back up into the lungs. So again, as you're looking at the slide, it says controls fluid balance in the body, and this is done by pressure and the amount of volume of fluid that's running across the kidneys. There are several sensors in the kidneys that will tell the body that it's not getting enough fluid across the kidneys to filtrate, and it will actually want to hold on to more fluid, or incorrectly, most oftentimes, tell the body to increase blood pressure, which just makes an injured heart work harder. It also controls the pH balance inside the blood. So as we're looking at the urinary system, you can see the kidneys, which are the main filtration, right? We can't see the vasculature, but there are large arteries and veins that go in and out of the kidneys. The kidneys then filter the water and salts out of the blood, and then it produces the urine, which goes through the ureter into the bladder, and then from the ureter opening into the bladder. On this particular slide, it's got a male anatomy, and it has a urethra that has to go through a prostate gland, through the penis, and then through the urethral opening to push waste out of the body externally. The genital system, anatomy, and physiology. So this is where the reproductive processes for life is created. In males, it lies outside of the body except for the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. In females, it's an internal organ, which is inside the pelvic cavity, except for the clitoris and the labia. So as we're looking at these pictures here, you can see the male genitalia there, and we have the testicles and the epididymis and the vasa differentia and the penis. The functions are for reproduction and the production of sex hormones. The penis is also part of the urinary system in males, as we saw in the slide previous. You can see the ureters into the urinary bladder and the vas deferens. Inside the female reproductive system, we can see that the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, and the vaginal canal. The functions are obviously for reproduction and the production of sex hormones. The life support chain. So the body's cells require oxygen. This is brought to you by respiratory and circulatory systems, right? And so that's the intake of oxygen, obviously through the pulmonary system and the circular system, which is the cardiovasculatory system, pushing blood out to the cells. Nutrients are brought in through the GI tract into the bloodstream. They're broken down by the digestive system into glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. And those are now circulated by the circulatory system. And then all of these systems remove waste as well from the circulatory system back into the corresponding areas where we excrete wastes, be that through exhalation, urination, or fecal matter. Aerobic metabolism using oxygen, that's the normal metabolism that we have on a consistent basis. This is the only possibility for some cells, right? So the heart and the brain require oxygen no matter what to function. They do not fare well with any kind of anaerobic metabolism. Most cells can operate without oxygen for 1 to 3 minutes, and often up to 10 minutes for a skeletal muscle. Lactic acid is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism, and this is just because the body is unable to actually oxygenate all those tissues quickly enough to get rid of the byproducts of metabolism, right? The burning of glucose and then converting oxygen to carbon dioxide, and the converted energy source then kind of builds up in the tissue and the bloodstream. The big three systems are responsible for the immediate status of life. Other systems are either responsible for the support of the big threes or provision of what is needed for the big three to maintain functions both at rest and during demand. Okay, so that was a lot of information, right? And so what I want everybody to remember is that you can break these down into simpler groups, right? And that's going to be the pulmonary system, transporting the byproducts of metabolism, which is going to be glucose and oxygen. Oxygen being used to oxidize the glucose, and the byproduct of that being carbon dioxide, and then the waste products that are going to be excreted elsewhere. So just remember, pulmonary is going to be the gaseous exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The cardiovascular system being the transport mechanism for oxygen and glucose to the cells, and then taking the carbon dioxide and other waste products from normal metabolism back out to be excreted. And then the GI system breaking down foods to its raw basic forms to be utilized by the cell, be that fatty acids, glucose, or any of the amino acids that the cells need for repair or function on a regular basis. If you guys have any questions, please make sure that you send it in an email, or we'll have it in the discussion board. I want to make sure that we answer all the questions on this, because this particular subject is going to help you basically understand the pathophysiology when any of these systems start to fail.